Hi students, let us now get to the actual textual analysis or exegesis of the text. This is where we take the text, analyze it, and this particular step is where we break up the text into smaller bits. It is sort of like eating a meal. When you sit down to eat, you don't just shove the whole plate of food into your mouth. You cut into the small pieces, you savor each bite, you enjoy each bite, and then after you're done, you've had a nice, delicious meal. If you were just stuffing your face with food, you would not be enjoying it properly. And so for me, this is a lot like eating a nice plate of food with your steak and your mashed potatoes or chips or however you want to have your potatoes, and just enjoying each bite as you go along. So we want to break it up into smaller bits and then analyze each part and then do some word studies on some important words and some important phrases within the text. And then we will bring it all together and actually start developing a sermon from there. So let us get into the actual breaking down of the text. Now, where do you start with a big block of text like this? For me, one of the rules, or it's a rule that I use mostly when I do my textual analysis, is the first thing is to highlight all the verbs. In other words, those words that are the doing words, the verbs, what is being done, what has been done, or what is. You have a couple of different types of verbs. So normally it's the stuff that is being done or that is getting done or that we are doing. But then there's also the ones that just define a specific state of something, to be or is or was. And so that's a non-transitive verb. And so what we're going to do is first of all in this text highlight the verb. So as we read, it's his divine power has granted. So there is our first verb, has granted. Now has is part of the granted because it is a descriptive of that granted. It is something that has been done. So has granted to us all things. So you select your verb, and what I normally do is I highlight it. You can choose the color that you want to use. I'm going to use this green as the color for my verbs. So his divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and good godliness. So this is still not really a verb, but we can get there. So through the knowledge of him who called us. So in other words, called is our next verb, to his own glory and excellence, by which again we have he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers. So, in other words, may become is a verb, so you are becoming or may become partakers of the divine nature. Having escaped, that is also a verb. Having escaped from corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. So now we already have our verbs that we've highlighted. The next one that you want to do is find the connecting words. So in other words, those are the words that build up a sentence or build up parts of a sentence. So things like so that, through, because, of, from, and those words that sort of like join parts of sentences together. So if we go again, his divine power is granted to us all things that, in other words, that pertain to. So this one here is a connecting word. It's all things, and the pertain to life and godliness describes these all things. So that. So we're going to highlight this a different color. I am just going to choose. Let's go with this orange that pertain or brown that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence by, I can say by which, he has granted to us his precious and varied promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from corruption that's in the world because of sinful desire. So, in other words, there's our connecting words. So, we're just highlighting stuff for now. We're going to break it down into smaller bits now. So one of the first things we can do is on the connecting words themselves, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to each one and I'm going to press enter on my keyboard. This is going to move it down to the line. I'm just going to go to every time I've got a connecting word and move it to the next line. Now, here's an interesting one. Because there is no technically connecting word, we're going to take the comma as sort of a connection. Okay, although it starts with a verb, we're going to take its connection. So I'm going to move that one to a line as well, and I'm going to say because of sinful desire. In other words, so we have now taken this big chunk of text, we're breaking it up into pieces, we're just splitting it up into manageable sizes so that we can understand what it's saying. So we now have these sentences or these parts that we want to start analyzing. Now, one of the things you can do from here on um, is to number them, is to give numbers to the lines themselves. I don't normally do it. I'd leave this like this, but you can if you want to number it, especially if you're dealing with a large text, you need to comment and say on line 45 I say this or whatever, then you can do that. However, I prefer to leave the numbering out of it. It just messes with the rest of the stuff. And you could leave the text like this and now start working on your word studies. However, I also will suggest that you do a further step on this to sort of give you a better thought structure or idea of what's happening in the text. So, what I mean by that is, His divine power is granted to us all things. Now, this all things, what does it do? How is it further described? It is that pertain to life and godliness. So that is what is meant by all things, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press tab on my keyboard. So the tab key on the keyboard, you can see that the text now moves towards the side, okay? And I want to move it under all things because that is what is being described by this. So His divine power is granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, right? His divine power is granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. And what does these all things do? Okay? Or how is it granted? Right? It is granted through the knowledge of Him who called us. So, in other words, His divine power has granted, these are the things that He's granted through the knowledge of Him who called us. So, through is matched with has granted. If we then look a bit further, so to His own glory and excellence, how does this connect? It is through the knowledge of Him who called us. How has He called us, or to what has He called us? To His own glory and excellence. So I'm going to move this all the way to the side here. He has called us to His own glory and excellence, right? And through that calling, okay, so yes, the divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, so that pertains to that. He has granted these things through the knowledge of Him who called us, and we are called to His own glory and excellence. So we can see how this now ties into that. And now the question is, by which He has granted to us His precious and very great promises. Okay? So the question is, does this by which fit into glory and excellence, or does it fit into something else higher up? Now, this is obviously where intuition comes into play, careful understanding, reading of the text, maybe looking at other translations and see how they all tie up. But what I can sense from this one, or when I look at this text, is divine power has granted to us all things. Now, these all things He has granted to us. So, in other words, because we have this connecting word of has granted to us, we can assume that He's talking about, but these all things, okay, and through all of these things that has been granted to us, He has also by these things, all things by which, okay. So I'm going to move this, and I'm going to actually leave the has granted. I'm going to try to align the has granted here at the bottom. Let them be the same. So by which He has granted to us, and what has He granted? Precious and very great promises. So, in other words, He's granted to us the following. Now, again, I can now decide that I actually want to make another line of this. So, I'm going to say, what has He granted to us? His precious and very great promises. So you can see as you're working through the text, you're starting to see certain things come to light. You're starting to see how the message starts making sense. And this is what's so beautiful about doing this textual analysis. It's you are really working with the text. You are dividing the text. You you are savoring each bit. I get very excited with this type of analysis, and this is not even the final product. We're gonna do so much more with this text, but this is just one way in which we can start breaking it down. And so, yeah, just as I go on a tangent of getting excited about what he says here, um, and so We have his precious and great promises that has been granted to us. So in other words, through the all things that pertain to life and godliness, and you can almost see that we've got this double play on words: life and godliness, precious and great promises, right? So there's sort of like a double word that Peter keeps on throwing in here. But anyway, so we continue: his precious and very great promises, okay? So that, in other words, through this granting of all things that pertain to life and godliness, and his precious and very great promises, so that through them, so what is them? Okay, now here's something that we need to now start doing with, right? So I'm gonna go to the word things here, okay, and I am gonna say border, and I am gonna outline this border, right? Because I want to start taking note of when he speaks about these things, right? So his divine power is granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. It is granted to us through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence. Okay. By which, now, by which? By these things, right? By these things, okay, is granted to us his precious and very great promises, right? All the things that pertain to life and godliness, what are they? His precious and very great promises. Okay. So that through them, so the things, the promises, technically I can say his precious very promises, that's also the things, right? He has granted to us his precious and very great promises, right? You may become partakers of the divine nature. So this is the end result. You become partakers of the divine nature, right? What does this mean, right? So I'm going to say by having escaped, in other words, we become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in this world. And how does this corruption come to us? Because of sinful desire. Okay, so I'm going to take it there. Now, here's an interesting thing. While I'm busy looking at this now, I'm starting to realize that maybe, you know what, His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of Him who called us to His own glory and excellence. Maybe this by which it's not the things, so I'm going to remove that. Maybe it's the calling, through the knowledge of Him who called us. And through this knowledge, by which He has granted us His precious and very great promises. Is this through the calling and through us being called to His glory and excellence? Or is it by His divine power that He has granted to us all things? By which He has granted. I'm gonna leave it. It's gonna be His divine power by which. So I'm gonna say that it is through His divine power He has granted to us all things, and by which, in other words, the divine power He has granted to us His precious and very great promises. It's in His power. It's through the knowledge. It's technically of all of these things, the power that's granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of Him who called us in our calling to His glory and excellence, and through all of this by which He has granted to us His precious and very great promises. It is because of this calling to His own glory and excellence that we also receive the precious and very great promises as we become partakers of the divine nature. So, in other words, this partaker, so through them, so the things that pertain to life and godliness, right? Through these things, okay, um, He has granted His precious and great promises. That through these precious and very great promises and all things that pertain to life and godliness, we may become partakers of the divine nature, which is the same as this being called to His own glory and excellence. And having been made partakers of His divine nature, we have escaped from the corruption that's in the world because of our sinful desire. So let's leave this for now, and then we will carry on in the next session on how to understand a lot of this a little bit more, how to break it up into a little bit more pieces, and maybe just start to get links between the different things, and then get a sermon from this.